welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and I have as a very special guest, I'm very excited to be able to speak to Phyllis Chesler, who I described in the chyron that's right under her right now, author, professor, feminist pioneer, and Zionist. And that's only the beginning. She has a very long and amazing career. Thank you very much, Chesler, for joining me.
It's my pleasure. I always wanted to meet the Elder of Zion.
Okay. Well, we have met, and you know that, but I've had very enjoyable dinners at your house, and you're a remarkable person, and you have also equally remarkable set of friends and colleagues that, and again, it's legendary. Every time I look at your bio and at your life and your history, I'm amazed. I truly am. Starting from, your original marriage that you spoke about, in 1961. And again, and that by itself is a topic, I'm just not going to say it, but you married a Muslim from Afghanistan, and were whisked over there and were essentially a prisoner. And this is, from what I understand, where you really got your original feminist ideas, right?
Yes. Yes, in retrospect.
Yeah, and then afterwards you became, as again my understanding, it's a long bio, but you got your PhD, you became a psychotherapist, and then you got involved in the what's called the second wave of feminist leadership.
MS.
Yeah. So.
Yes.
And many of those women were Jewish also.
Yes, but many were not. There were more. Jews are always involved in progressive or radical organizations more than our existence in the population demographically, and that means both men and women who were Jews. Mm-hmm. I have to say that when I encountered anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in 1971 in New York City among leftists. And I'd been moving in left-wing circles for the decade, and in feminist circles, it sent me straight to Israel for the first time, a very long overdue visit.
So what you're saying is that you heard the anti-Zionism and you decided to investigate for yourself?
That's it. Well, I didn't believe it because in childhood, I went against the rabbis in Borough Park, which agonized my mother a lot. And I joined Hashomer Hatzair because it seemed to me a model of liberation that appealed to me in childhood. And I went to Hebrew schools. I knew how important Israel was to us as a people. I didn't believe the lies that were already coming out of the United Nations, and that, I stood there, not on street corners with the Karen Kayemet boxes, but although I did that too when I was much younger, I tried to get signatures against the UN resolution claiming that Zionism equals racism, but as we now know, according to Judea Pearl, it's really anti-Zionism that equals racism, and it's racism against the Jews, which is never included in all the textbooks we read about prejudice and racism. So having gone to Israel, I was then, I signed up in the army of cognitive warfare on Israel's behalf. I took journalists to Israel in the mid-'70s. I made feminist speeches in Israel throughout the '70s. And when I worked for the United Nations in 1979-80 and was present at that conference in Copenhagen, I flew immediately to Israel afterwards and persuaded the Misrat HaChutz, the foreign office, to allow me to put together a real conference about women's rights, because Copenhagen was a precursor of Durban, and it was all about blaming Israel, not about women's rights. And I worked with the delegation from Israel who did not know what hit them. The most poignant memory I have is Mina Ben Svi, who was the commander of Chen during the War of Independence. She wept in my arms and she said, "What is this? I thought we were done with this."
Sure.
And there were others, part of the Mishlachat, the delegation, who were tougher. Shula Aloni, for example, whom I'd invited to debate Layla Khalid
Oh,
at
wow.
that conference. But Khalid wouldn't come. She said, I will talk to her out of the barrel of a gun.
Exactly. Layla Khan, for those who don't know, is the hijacker of more than one. I mean, at least two planes in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and she's still alive,
Yes.
and she still is a member of the PFLP. So yeah, that's
It's unbelievable, the glorification of Death Eaters. I take the phrase from Harry Potter series. Death Eaters who eat death, who are death, who wish to visit death upon others, and yet they're romantic figures like Che Guevara.
yeah. It's. I mean, you've been fearless in talking about this sort of thing. It's at the same time that everybody else got very afraid of what Islamophobia or anything like that. You're like saying, hey, if I'm being a consistent feminist, I have to speak out against things that I see as being a problem.
Yes, and I'm very sad that so many other feminists are too afraid or are too indoctrinated. So, for example, I first heard about women's confinement, the downside of polygamy, the downside of face veiling, of burqas, a long time ago. So, as I began to hear about female genital mutilation and worse, honor killings, I couldn't deny it. It wasn't, though, until the 21st century that I began some studies on honor killing. And I was accused initially by feminists of being a racist and an Islamophobe. And I would say, wait a minute, the victims here are mainly women of color. They're not only Muslims, but in the West they are mainly Muslims. They're also Sikhs. They're also Hindus, but only in India. I don't see what's wrong with this. Well, of course, if a man of color who is viewed as colonized and therefore innocent, especially if allegedly colonized by Israelis, does anything evil, you're not allowed to say that. You say instead in the pages of the New York Times, militants, gunmen, gunmen on horses, the Janjaweed.
But it's worse than that, because I mean the UN, even as recently as last year, will mention that there's men are beating their wives in Palestinian territories, and then they say the reason is because of the occupation.
Yes, well, this goes back to the so-called once distinguished medical journal, The Lancet, who published a completely politicized piece of crap with researchers from all the Ivy Leagues signing on, in which they said that the rate of wife beating had increased in Gaza and on the West Bank due to the Israeli occupation. So I looked at this and I thought, did they have a control group in Saudi Arabia? Did they have a control group in Afghanistan or Pakistan? I don't think so. Of course they didn't. And so this was all completely made up stuff.
Sure.
And we launched a battle. I published a letter in their pages. I got a group together that indeed included eventually Nobel Prize winning scientists who disputed this, and physicians as well, which was published in their pages. And the editor-in-chief promised he wouldn't do it no more. He'd be a good boy. Right. But then he fell down on his promise rather recently. And it's quite, one of the things that's so distressing is the places that we used to turn to for high culture, for credible facts, for scientific facts, for studies in the social sciences. It's all gone, because now, as I said in one recent piece, it's a steady acidic drip, drip, drip of, you could be reading a book review, as I was in the New York Review of Books, and there's Israeli apartheid. Just dropped into the sentence, totally irrelevant, out of context, doesn't exist, but the accusation sticks.
Yeah.
Or, as we were talking, obituaries are politicized now. So, not just now, they have been for, I'd say, most of the 21st century. dies. You mentioned Ariel Sharon. I don't remember that obituary, but I believe every word you said. There's a recent real estate South African businessman who died, and they really presented him as a pushy Jew who made too much money, and as if apartheid in South Africa was somehow his fault, when in fact he opened some of the hotels, casinos, gambling joints, where he allowed people of all colors to come and stay. That was his crime. That was and his punishment was being blamed for doing so and fingered as as a pro-apartheid fellow.
Sure.
So
I'm showing this on the screen right now. This is your recent piece in Arutz Sheva,
yes,
where you mentioned about this sort of thing.
it's mutations of Jew hatred that it's not just in political journals, it's not just in certain online venues, which we'll talk about, but it's anything you pick up, anywhere. It's almost like people are brandishing their credentials cheaply by showing that they hate Jews, showing that they hate the Jewish state. They're so cool, they're so sophisticated.
You're right, and they're so brave.
So brave.
They think it's so brave in order to say it when everybody else is saying it. It's just, and I mean, I'm fairly convinced that this is it sounds weird, but it's like, I mean, the whole thing seemed to have started in the Soviet Union. This is the propaganda is very, very identical to what the Soviet anti-Israel propaganda was after '67, and people have traced this before. You know, the exact same accusations. And it seems like this is like a ghost of the Soviet Union. That is the anti-Semitism that came from that seems to be something that survived the end of the Soviet Union, and it's truly amazing because now it's just but it's not individuals, I don't think so much, because it's been drummed into people for so long. It started in campus, which is where all of this the socialist ideas came from, and then became popular. But they became so ingrained it's already 2 generations after. And now and those people became writers and unfortunately politicians, and now it's considered just like, hey, of course everybody knows this. Just there was slavery, and that there was that, but there was this, and then there's apartheid, and that's that. It's just
the universities, and I think you're right. But see, Stalin still lives, therefore, and I've written that nervously, but I think it's true. Let's say you're a high school student. Let's say you're a first-year college student. And if you're in this current generation, you're used to using the internet for all research. The fact that it's not peer-mediated, the fact that it could be completely lies matters not, because it's accessible, it's easy, it's fast, it's quick. And these are all current values. So let's say you wanted to look up the Al-Dura myth. Let's say you wanted to look into the Jenin myth, the massacre that the Israelis allegedly perpetrated there. You would come to, you'd Google it. From Google, they would send you right to Wikipedia. But on Google itself would be many pages of articles in which you would learn that, for example, Jenin was terrible, horrible, the worst. In Yvonne Ridley, that lunatic's words, I don't know if everyone knows who she is. She was a journalist who was captured by the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And unlike myself, I wasn't. The Taliban had not arisen yet, but they're endemic to the country. The poor country is cursed. And she converted to Islam thereafter, runs around looking like Lawrence of Arabia in London, and I've had occasion to debate her. She's totally for the Palestinian people, a group that hasn't existed historically, but she said that the Jenin massacre was the worst human rights atrocity ever in the history of the world. I mean,
we spoke about this last week with Richard. So just again, as background, Jenin was in 2002 when the Intifada was in full force, and Israel finally decided to go on the offensive because there was really no other way of stopping it. Jenin was where the terrorism really came from, and Israel, for reasons that are, in retrospect, really, really unclear, decided it seems to be for PR reasons, instead of bombing where they knew the people were, from the top, they decided that looks bad. We're going to have to go door to door fighting, and
I
they.
don't know. PR. I think that the international pressure on Israel not to defend herself
Yeah, that's.
to was so great and so grave, and who knows what kinds of threats were made of withholding this or of bringing that down on Israel. So I think it was the blood is on the world's hands for those 23 young men who went into booby-trapped alleyways, home to home to home, being shot at by snipers who jumped out of ambulances, by snipers who were in mosques, and the IDF has very strong ethical guidelines, and the soldiers they could not shoot at the mosque, they could not shoot at an ambulance, and they did not. And their behavior, in a very beautiful book by Brett Goldberg, A Psalm for Jenin, he describes the individuals and what they were facing and how they behaved. They carefully would roll up oriental rugs, not to damage it with muddy boots. They wouldn't take the food, even if they were very hungry, that was there. One fellow brought candies in his vest to give out to Palestinian children. He was hopeful he could do this. 23 died.
Yeah, I know. 23 Israelis and only like 50, I believe the number was 52 Palestinians.
56, but they were armed.
They're right,
they were
armed. But the rumors immediately came out, and the Palestinian Authority and Saeb Erekat and everybody came out and said there was hundreds and hundreds, was a gigantic massacre, complete lie. And what you wrote about, again, I'll bring it on the screen right now, but you wrote about it at the Investigative Project of Terrorism, and I just tested this out. I just went to Google, which is, again, I'm bringing up right now. And here's the problem, and this is what you bring up, and it's an extremely important fact. Google has recently started to, not recently, maybe a year or two ago, has started to try to, in order to help people, they said, let's assume that this is the question people want to answer, and we'll give the real answer on top, and then all of the articles you can do your own research after that using our normal algorithm. So, if you ask the question, how many Palestinians were killed in Jenin in 2002, and I did this right now, I did it 5 minutes ago, it said 500 Palestinians because it quotes the Electronic Intifada as being the source of what happened in Jenin. And of course, the Electronic Intifada is a ridiculous anti-Semitic hate site. That has no relationship to the truth in what it writes, and this is one example of it. Yet this is the highlighted answer that Google gives. Now, very often they'll give answers from Wikipedia, but not always. Sometimes they're just going to decide, we think this article is the one that's going to answer you the best. Sometimes they're wrong. Usually, sometimes they're right, but this is egregious. And it's really unbelievable that Google is, supposed to be trying to be a repository of all the world's knowledge is really what they're trying to do, and yet they're allowing themselves. And I don't know if this is an algorithm or if this is a person that actually made this decision. I can't imagine it's an algorithm. But somehow they decided that this is this, and the number 500 is what pops up. 500 Palestinians. This is the number of Palestinians that were killed. Absolute lie. No bearing on the truth. How do you fight something like that?
Well, that is the question, because all these swirling around our heads, the Jews have caused, if not immodesty in women, then it's the Jews that have caused the Wuhan virus, so say countless imams and mullahs. But I was just thinking, and I know I have it in one of my recent articles, that I thought idly, I wonder if I Google Palestinian terrorism, what I would get. Mm-hmm. And what you get is, as you pointed out, it's straight from Pravda. What you get is the justification for any violence, because it's political violence, which they explain has everything to do with a desire for national sovereignty, for liberation, and against settler colonialism.
Right, and now, I just typed it in myself as well, so we can see.
Is it still up there?
When you first type it, the first thing that comes up, well, there's two things. First, the Times of Israel has a topic link on Palestinian terrorism. Number two is a Wikipedia article that is called Palestinian Political Violence. And then they say you can go to designations of terrorism.
Right. And it says, I just have it, that political objectives include self-determination in and sovereignty over Palestine, quote, the liberation of Palestine, and recognition of a Palestinian state, either in place of both Israel and the Palestinian territories, or solely in the Palestinian territories. Also, of course, it includes key aim is to advance the Palestinian right of return, which we all know means the destruction and elimination of Israel. So nobody ever in the 21st century pointed out that, come to think of it, there's a lot of ethnic cleansing of Jews in the Arab and Muslim world, and certainly in the disputed territories. How come we're cool with that? That's okay.
Right.
But the idea that Israel might want to be really a Jewish nation state, that's not okay. It's okay to have 56, 57 totally Islamic states. It's not okay to have one Jewish state, because that means apartheid, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, imperialism, when in fact, what you won't understand unless you're a scholar of some kind is that the history of Islam is a history of colonialism, imperialism, conversion via the sword, gender apartheid, religious apartheid. I mean, look at what Muslims are doing to Christians all over the Muslim world. Absolutely. Crucifying them, burning them, if they're lucky, exiling them, jailing them. There are countless campaigns ongoing about this, but if you Google for it, you'd have to hunt.
Yeah, no, it's true. The only place in the Middle East that Christian population is growing is in Israel, of course. It's and the Palestinians as well. It's gone way down. It's and they blame Israel. They say, oh, it's because is Israel somehow targeting the Christians in Bethlehem and not the Muslims?
Not at all. That's where Arafat, mounted his the early stages of the Intifada of 2000, which I knew the moment the Al-Dura myth was upon us, the second that Arafat launched his pre-planned Intifada, long planned, after he rejected all offers for peace or for two states, I knew, just as I knew when we had 9/11, that this was big, this was going to continue, and that we are all Israelis. Because look what happened after 9/11. We can't go to airports without taking off our shoes and our jackets. We have to wait on long lines. Everything changed. It became as if the world was an Israeli consulate.
That's true. It's funny you mentioned that. There's a Palestinian female terrorist, I think the first one that was arrested, in fact, back in 67 or 68. She tried to put a bomb in a movie house. And and years after, she got released in a prisoner exchange, and she ended up becoming one of the top police chiefs in under Arafat. But then somebody once asked her, well, you weren't successful. Nothing. They caught the bomb. And she goes, no, I was successful because nowadays every Israeli or everybody in the world has to go through guards in order to be able to go to a movie and go to a supermarket and stuff like that. So she was proud that that this was her legacy. And I've seen this sort of thing before, that Palestinians seem to crave relevance. That it's not that it's like they need to know whether, it's like a 2-year-old toddler that really needs to scream in order, because I have to know that you're actually paying attention to me. And this is where she was coming. She was like, well, look, I'm proud I am that, now the world has guards and planes and everything like that. And I'm the one that started that whole thing. That now everybody has to be, billions and billions of dollars are now spent on security because of me.
That's interesting. I thought that in a way, the Palestinianization of all the social sciences and the humanities, not the hard sciences.
Yes.
But that the idea that a country that doesn't exist and that has never existed is so important and so real, just as all that followed. Now men can become women, women can become men, everything as you wish it to be, as you imagine it, as you want it, can happen. Now, this is very deluded thinking. This is, and I think this obsessiveness about the freedom of a country that doesn't exist when there are so many hotspots in the world. I mean, one of the points I make in the investigative project on terrorism piece is the biggest massacre ever in Jenin. What would 500,000 dead Syrians have to say about that?
Right. It's like
Which is like forgotten, under the rug, not relevant. And the lies keep coming. And you asked a question, how do we deal with it? And all I can say is we're draining the swamps, just as the Chalutzim, who came initially to Palestine. We are draining the swamps, and it's very tedious. It's very dangerous because you lose your trendy reputation, I can assure you. And but that's the least of it. And you can't get published, and your books get attacked. That's the least of it. It's that with the internet, which we had hoped would be more of a democratizing technology, with the internet, the big lies are everywhere in every language 24/7. And the virus that we're dealing with is not just the Wuhan virus, and I got a lot of pushback when I insisted on calling it the Wuhan virus. I pointed out, wait a minute, the Spanish influenza. I mean, China is a place, it's not a race.
Right, of course.
This obsession with race above everything else, and maybe there is house cleaning to be done, long overdue. I don't deny it. I think that it's true. But this obsession with race totally swept away feminism's concern with gender, with sexism. Racism became the ultra, and then it was slightly, not replaced, but it had to be transgender rights. And both of these obsessions completely forget about women and the ordinary woman's problems.
Yep, that's the irony. In other words, there's a hierarchy of victimhood, and all of these other things became more got higher up, and then the feminism got pushed down.
But it's worse. I always read Publishers Weekly. It's a habit since 1969. It reviews books months before they're out. More and more books are about like Palestinian cuisine, mornings in Jenin. I mean, fine. There are more and more reviews that are positive if the author is a person of color, and the books may be great. I haven't read them. And reviews by white authors or about Jewish sorrows either don't get reviewed or get slammed.
Yeah.
This is true in many, many reviewing venues. It's not just one.
Yeah, no, again, but that's just, I think that's where things are coming out from the college campus and essentially infects everything else. That these are political correctness. People have been talking about this for 20, 30 years now, but but this became part of it. And the people that are against Israel are extremely good at knowing how to propagandize this and knowing how to say that. I mean, again, whether people believe it or not initially, just by the sheer repetition of saying that, well, racism and anti-Zionism go hand in hand. They do everything they can to put the two together, and it's the exact opposite. It's like racism and Zionism, whatever, they're the same.
No, that's the United Nations.
Yeah.
And it's all the international human rights organizations that Gerald Steinberg at NGO Monitor has continued to expose and has recently exposed in terms of blaming Israel for the virus and much else, for everything. It's, but I was also, did you check, I'm just curious, when I checked Al-Dura, because when that happened, that's what brought Richard and Landis and Nidra Paula and myself together. When that big lie happened.
So just to explain to the audience, make sure this is the Palestinian child that essentially the picture of him cowering behind a barrel, in which it was shown afterwards that it was absolutely impossible that Israel could have shot him, but nevertheless that the lie was pushed by a French TV network and journalists, and then it ended up becoming accepted as fact, and that was really part of what really jump started the entire Intifada.
Well, if you Google it, as I did the other day, or 5, 6 days ago, if you Google it, you will get the story according to Charles Endelon, who was the French journalist who claimed that he had footage so graphic and so awful that he couldn't show it. And after several lawsuits, he sued Philippe Carcenti, um, who said, "Oh, come on, that's not true. That boy was not killed, or not by Israelis at the Netzarim Junction." Um, he he didn't retract it. He sued Philippe.
Yes.
And if you Google it, you will get Charles Endelon first. Francis, I think it's Channel 2. And then if you continue to click on the first article, at the very bottom of it, after you've been completely propagandized, you will then see, oh, there is controversy that exists about this. So-and-so, a physicist, Nachum Shahaf, did the ballistics, and there's no way that the IDF could have shot this boy in that position. And then there's Esther Shapira from Germany, who did a film, and then there's Nidra and Richard, who did countless brilliant analyses of how the myth was then used. And it's a classic blood libel, because it's Jews are killing children, purposely killing children, the very last thing we would do. But it does expose the thinking and the practices of our opponents in the matter, because this is what they do by using human shields, civilians,
Sure.
and children as human shields, their own as well. Mm-hmm. So all of the biggest lies about the Jews reveal everything to us about who is hating the Jews, what they would do if they were in a position to do so.
And that's and deep down everybody knows it, but again, they're worried about saying it. I mean, it's like even Mahmoud Abbas. He lived in Sfat, and his parents fled ahead of any Israeli soldier. He never saw an Israeli soldier. His parents fled. But the reason, when you find the original interviews before he changed his story, is that they said, we were worried that the Jews were going to do to us what we did to them in 1929. So,
Right.
And that was it. That's the reason people fled. They figured, hey, they're now on the upside. They're going to do to us what we would have done to them under the same circumstances. Yes. And it's been around for this projection, this psychological projection
Yes.
of Palestinians has been around for a huge amount of time. And it's and the fact that people don't recognize that is really sad, because Israel goes so far out of its way to avoid any of these sort of things. And it's and unfortunately, again, it's got much better in the Hasbara, as far as explaining itself, than it used to be. But it's still, it's a huge task to be able to go against that.
We're coming from behind, Kamo Yaakov. We are coming from behind instead of launching an offensive that's massive. Years ago, I called for a Stuxnet virus approach in Al Jazeera, but that's Jewish, that covers the world, but when it covers Israel, it's not biased. But no large funders ever came to the rescue. Now, it's interesting, funders and individual Jews each believe that each of us has the right idea, the right solution, the thing to do, and if we can fund ourselves, we do so. If a funder can pay for what he or she wants, that's what they do so. So it's so many of us. Yes. Doing separately the work that we need to do together. We need to bring our forces together. And I'm not a techie, so I can't hijack a website. I can't add to a website the truth. Yeah. I can't keep doing it, but we need to do that.
That's on behalf of like a Wikipedia type things, obviously, because there is serious bias in Wikipedia, and a lot of the,
yes.
And certainly in a lot of the articles about Israel and about the Palestinians and about Arabs altogether, you will see that you can go through the talk section, you can see the history, and at least Wikipedia is at least transparent that way. You can see the history of people trying to change and how things change back, and eventually, I mean. Wikipedia tries, eventually they'll say, hey, we're just going to block any changes to this article because it's just things are going back and forth and back and forth. But nevertheless, who makes the determination? Whoever's the more powerful editor is the one that does it. Unfortunately, very often that most powerful editor is somebody who's anti-Israel.
Well, no one who rises in these times can do so if they're not anti-Israel, which explains the sad phenomenon of the Jews who turn on Israel or who demand perfection, uba'alis, only from the Jewish state, and not finding it cannot bear the burden, the weight of all the hatred. I mean, that's another whole subject. I was just mentioning, I was reading Rabbi Jonathan Sachs on the Torah. He's so smooth and brilliant and creative. And there's a whole history of Jews who've turned on Jews.
Sure.
And with the most lethal of consequences, lethal. So I think we're seeing that. It's part of, and that means adding, the greatest credential is I'm Jewish, but, or I'm a Jew,
Yeah.
and,
Yes.
as if every
As
Jew,
a Jew,
yeah. Let me tell you, right?
Yeah.
I'm George Soros. I'm a Jew, and
Therefore, yeah, exactly.
but your question, Elder, is a haunting question. What can we do? We have to do everything we can for as long as it takes. We need to mentor the next generations who are willing to take on this task, which is a holy task. And yes, at some point it requires not just numbers, but money. And here we are now in the midst of a pandemic when economic structures are in free fall.
Yes.
So this is a historical moment. We will never go back to the way the world was before. And in some ways that might be good, in other ways terrible.
Yeah, everybody thinks about that. It's very hard to know how this is going to shake out. I mean, it's just nobody knows.
I don't think we can have, I think Europe will consider borders again.
I think so. No, I think that if anything, and again, we're already a little bit over time over here, but I do think that this has, to an extent, proven nationalism as being, really much stronger than, because the EU was, obviously a very anti-national idea, and as soon as this crisis comes up, everybody starts, saying, hey, we want our people back.
Yes.
All of a sudden they became patriots again, which I found fascinating. As far as and it's so I think I think that is one change that I think it has severely wounded the idea of an international leadership that gets to decide for everybody what to do. And the UN also has been completely ineffective. Nobody looks at the UN and saying, "Hey, you solve our," except for some very poor nations that have no choice. But but nobody's going to the UN and saying, "Hey, this is a world crisis. You should step in and take care of it." Nobody's saying that. Everyone's saying, my nation's leaders are the ones that should be saving, that should be taking care of me. Nobody says the UN should do that unless they're completely incompetent leadership. So I think that's definitely that's one. But I think there's going to be a lot of changes.
So you're saying that we're over time?
Yes, well, it's the time that you wanted. I would be happy to talk to you forever, but
Same here. What are the questions, if any?
There really wasn't much. It was just a couple of comments. It's not really somebody. I mean, again, whatever.
Well, I may not have any answers, so it's just as well.
Yeah. Somebody saying, Google engineers are leftists. Yeah, I mean, some of them are. We've seen that, but it's there was the incident in which one Google engineer did write a something about about women personalities or something like that. Whether it was true or not, but he was essentially fired. For saying that women couldn't be as good engineers in general as men. I don't agree with that, but it's he had points, and I don't see anything that was offensive by making those points. But he was fired. So that was pretty much what they're talking about over here. And I think another person was mentioning slavery in the Muslim world. To talk about that, which is. Let me
plug one of my books. I have a book on honor killing out at New English Review Press, called A Family Conspiracy, Honor Killing. It's a collection of my studies and my journalism. And I have another book with them called Islamic Gender Apartheid, A Veiled War Against Women. And if you really want to understand Islam and women, these books would be very useful.
And I've read one of them, and excellent, absolutely true. It's
Thank you.
and again, but that's the point. That's the reason you're being consistent as far as you are being unyieldingly pro-feminist, which happens to also coincide
Yes.
with being a Zionist and being against Muslim misogyny, and it's like no, and it's hard to think that it's amazing that people don't see that as a consistent position nowadays. So you're a trailblazer even now.
Well, I'm against misogyny, but I don't exclude Muslims. I would put it that way.
Sure. Okay. No. And we should. Nobody's saying. I'm just saying, but
But
you
I
call it
think
out.
I want to close on a Torah-dic note.
Okay.
So, honor killing, right? That's a family that decides a female member, usually a young daughter, teenager, has been seen talking to a boy, or her head veil slipped, or there's a wide variety of so-called crimes she can commit, and the family's honor is at stake. If they don't kill her, then nobody else will marry into their family. Nobody will do business with them. It's like a death sentence.
Yep.
So they kill her. Now, if we go back to the Torah, to Bereshit, to the Parsha Vayishlach, there's Dinah who's held captive by Shechem in Nablus, always Nablus,
Yes.
always Shechem, and her brothers, in a controversial move, break her out, rescue her, kill all the men who, no doubt, allowed this to go on, did not stop it, right? Didn't rescue her themselves. Shimon and Levi, long before Sinai, do not kill her because she shamed them. That's interesting, isn't it?
They kill the people that were guilty of shaming.
Yes, and they don't kill the woman who's the victim.
Correct.
In Islam, too often, the women who are raped and who allege rape, it's a death sentence for the women.
Yes. No, you're 100% right, and it's and this is part of the entire honor shame system. That, and again, Rabbi Sachs makes a very good point about this, saying that the Torah does not have that. The Torah does push the system where you actually take responsibility for your own actions, and guilt is the opposite of honor shame. But he makes it's a very convincing argument that it was nothing to do with time period or anything like that. This is these are some cultural norms are better than others, and that's a hard thing for a lot of people to hear nowadays.
Yes, because everything is equal, everything is the same.
So, anyway, again, I would love to keep talking to you. It's a lot of fun.
Come back.
We'll do it again. Very good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, it was great. Thanks again. This is again Elder of Zion speaking with Phyllis Chesler. We will see you next time.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.